president here at the Middle East Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to our series of events looking at President Biden's first 100 days in office and the record of the administration in dealing with the many strategic challenges and issues confronting the United States in the Middle East region. First of all, I would like to thank our guests, Joey Hood and Elise Labat, for kicking off this series of events. I hope you all had an opportunity to listen in as Joey talked about the view from the State Department for these last 100 days. Now I would like to welcome you to the first of two panels that we have organized that are going to bring together a group of MEI scholars to look more in depth at a number of the very specific issues that are confronting the administration, where we were on January 20th, 2021, where we are today, and hopefully some thoughts about where this might be pointing us towards the future. The discussion on this first panel covers a broad range of functional issues, including human rights, counterterrorism, defense, and cybersecurity. And we have organized an excellent panelist, an excellent panel of experts who are going to lead us through these discussions. They are drawn largely from the MEI briefing book, The Biden Administration in the Middle East, Policy Recommendations for a Sustainable Way Forward. And that covers key geopolitical and strategic areas in the MENA region. You can find a link to the report in the chat box and on our website. In order of appearance to join us for the conversation this morning, first we would like to welcome Charles Dunne. Charles is a non-resident scholar here at the Middle East Institute. Prior to his current position, he spent 24 years as a Foreign Service officer, serving overseas in Cairo, Jerusalem, and Madras, India. Next, I would like to welcome Charles Lister. Charles is a senior fellow here at the Institute and director of both the Syrian and counterterrorism programs of MEI. After that, Chris Kubecka. Chris is a distinguished senior fellow and chair of MEI's cyber program and the co-founder and CEO of HyperSec. And then finally, I'm pleased to welcome my old friend and colleague, General Mike Nagata. Mike is a distinguished senior fellow here at MEI, having served for 38 years on active duty with the U.S. Army. General Nagata's final position was Director of Strategy for the National Counterterrorism Center from 2016 to 2019. To submit your questions, please use the Zoom Q&A feature, which you can find on your Zoom screens. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question through MEI by emailing events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, please also email events@mei.edu. And you can feel free to ask a question anytime during our panel discussions. I'll be monitoring the chat, and we'll factor in as many of your questions as possible in the discussion. So let me begin, and I should also mention that Charles Lister unfortunately will have to drop off the call after about 30 minutes. So let me begin with Charles and ask him to provide a little bit of an overview of the CT environment over these last 100 days. And I think it's interesting to note that the president in his remarks last night to Congress noted how the CT challenge is metastasizing beyond Syria and Iraq, but to also include challenges in Yemen in the Horn of Africa and the Sahel and elsewhere in the region, how far we've come from 20 years ago and the 9/11 attacks. So, Charles, if you want to talk a little bit about how you've seen these last 3 months and what you think are the indicators for the future.
Jerry, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I do apologise that I'm not able to be here for the whole session, but I look forward to the 30 minutes or so that I'm able to be here for. I'll try to be relatively brief and start by going a little bit more than 100 days back and looking at how the Biden campaign had discussed CT issues in terms of framing some of its expectations, kind of policy red lines. And I think the biggest thing known within the CT community, as far as I'm aware, is that President Biden himself sort of coined his own CT term. He calls it counterterrorism plus, which is, to put in a simplistic terms, a method of CT that we've seen increasingly implemented. It's a short or small footprint, special forces, heavy focus, investment in capacity building with local partners to counter the kind of terrorism threats that the United States faces, both at home, but also within local environments. And of course, I think within the campaign's context, that was seen within the CT community as quite encouraging. Of course, as I'll come on to say, and as you said, in terms of the speech last night, the terrorism threats that we face now are metastasizing. They're more diverse than they've ever been. And so clearly the challenges that we face in the CT realm aren't going away. And I think, going back to the campaign, there was some suggestion over concern about the Trump administration's decision or desire to withdraw from Afghanistan. There was criticism of the withdrawal from Somalia. There was a great deal of support expressed towards how sustainable the counter-ISIS mission and our footprint was in Syria and Iraq. But at the same time, domestically here within the US, I think we all are very aware that there's this ongoing kind of battle between the desire within part, at least, of the Democratic Party to end the endless wars. And then on the other side of that kind of struggle, the desire to continue to strategically assert the United States abroad, if and wherever necessary, in pursuit of our own interests. And that kind of tussle, I think, is now playing out with the Biden administration in the White House over the past 100 years. I think there's kind of two realities that Biden faced when he came into office. The first one is that the US homeland is arguably safer today than it has been since 9/11 from a 9/11 style externally directed attack on the US homeland. The other reality, though, is that globally, the jihadist threat has arguably never been more diverse, more militarily potent, more geographically distributed, and more deeply rooted in more pockets of the world. And again, those two battles are still facing off in the policy realm about how much should we still be focusing on the CT realm. Is our only priority protecting the homeland, or should we care more about the more locally rooted movements that we're seeing diversify so significantly around the world, and in particular in the Middle East and in Africa? And so I think in that sense, counterterrorism was always going to be the front line of this struggle between pleasing or assuaging domestic concerns about forever wars or endless wars, but also continuing to be engaged abroad. And so what have we really seen? I mean, we've seen announcements of a US disengagement from the air campaign in Yemen. We've seen the de-designation of the Houthis. And so far, as Acting Assistant Secretary Hood said just earlier this morning to the Middle East Institute, the consequences of that haven't been entirely promising so far. The Houthis responded to both of those measures by going on the offensive in Marib, and by spoiling or working against any effort for peace talks, perhaps more aggressively than they were doing before. We've also seen the announcement of a withdrawal from Afghanistan, which has clearly generated quite a debate. There's no doubt that 20 years of engagement in Afghanistan is a particularly long time, but I would raise the question of whether or not maintaining a relatively small troop number of perhaps 3.5 to 4,000 troops was more preferable to what seems increasingly likely, which is the Afghan National Army coming under full assault by the Taliban. And if anyone reads the New York Times report yesterday from Afghanistan, that was incredibly grim reading about the prospects of being able to withstand domestically a Taliban offensive with no US troops on the ground. In Syria and Iraq, though, we have seen a continuation of the counter-ISIS campaign, although questions do continue to surround the extent to which our troops will remain engaged in Iraq. And questions in Syria focus predominantly on ISIS's resurgence in regime areas and the extent to which the US may or may not be able to prevent that or to preempt that resurgence from spilling over across the Euphrates River into US administered areas. So, and then beyond that, just to sort of close out, Africa, which is a region that is kind of on the periphery of MEI's mandate, but Africa is now the most biggest potent hotspot of terrorist and jihadist activity, from Somalia to Nigeria to Mozambique, the Sahel, the Maghreb in North Africa, the DRC, Central African Republic, and many other countries are now seeing a significant spike in jihadist activity. But so far, there doesn't seem to be much of a either US or international response to that reality. Now, these all collectively are not problems that we can scoff at. They're also not problems that won't or may not eventually hit the US at home if they're not addressed collectively as they are spiking right now. So I think it would be a mistake to think that the US shouldn't be part of the equation or the response. I should also add here that when everyone is talking about how important great power competition is, counterterrorism theaters are arguably one of the most significant front lines now of great power competition. When they are left to decay, as we have seen, our great power competitors are more than happy to step in, exert their influence, establish new relationships, and undermine the US within that local environment, and then secondarily within the broader region. And it's essentially up to us now whether we're willing to square the circle of assuaging concerns about forever wars, but also not missing the trick here. In terms of thinking that we can please a domestic constituency by disengaging without having to go back, as we saw in Iraq and Syria over the last 5 years or so, and clean up a mess that was even bigger than the one that we dealt with the first time around. And I guarantee you that the next threats that we face, if we continue on this trajectory, will arguably be even bigger and more difficult to uproot than the ones we faced 5 years ago.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you for your uplifting message. But I think that it offers. I mean, it offers a very rich kind of framework for the discussion going forward. And I want to turn to Mike next and ask him, because many of the issues that Charles has put on the table are, of course, extremely relevant from a U.S. military standpoint. Not only the large, kind of meta question of where the U.S. military posture is going to be in the Middle East as we go forward, but we heard, for example, Charles's comment about the CT plus framework that President Biden established. And yet seemed to abandon when he made the decision that he was going to pull out of Afghanistan entirely. And certainly it's no secret that within the US military establishment, there were serious doubts about whether or not we shouldn't, we shouldn't maintain some kind of at least special operations capacity inside of Afghanistan to help preserve the Afghan government and security establishment, as well as continuing to press our CT advantage. But beyond that, also clearly the Iranians are challenging the U.S. military in new and active ways in the Persian Gulf and elsewhere. And so, Mike, if I can ask you the same question from your perspective, what do you see as the main themes of the last 100 days, the main challenges and what do you think the prospect is going forward?
Thank you, Jerry, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this distinguished panel. I wish I could say that what I'm about to convey to you and the audience is more uplifting than anything Charles had to say, but I'm sorry to report I probably won't be. First of all, let me start by 100% agreeing with something Charles said near the very end. The trajectory that I personally believe the United States is on, which actually began before the new administration, to contract away from counterterrorism efforts in the interest of doing important things like getting better at great power competition with near peer adversaries and what have you, while understandable, is going to have unintended large-scale consequences that I personally believe, whether it's this administration or future administrations, are probably going to regret. Now, let me try to take this in a reasonably orderly and brief fashion. Let me start with Afghanistan. Even though technically not part of the Middle East, it obviously has enormous impact on the Middle East. The decision to completely withdraw by this September creates some policy benefits for the administration. Number one, they're going to be able to claim they brought an end to the so-called endless war. It will harvest resources for other important strategic efforts. But there are at least three risks, I think, that I personally do not understand how the administration intends to manage, and I think these are inevitable risks. The first one is that organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS will follow the age-old adage that nature abhors a vacuum. They will seek to take advantage of the departure of American personnel and American forces in ways to both grow their capabilities and expand their reach. It's very clear the Taliban have no intention of severing their relationship with Al-Qaeda. No one needs an explanation by how aggressively ISIS can grow if given the opportunity. And whether or not that ever amounts to or creates a future 9/11 style attack on the homeland, the violence and instability that is likely to emerge from that growth will be a threat to American interests regionally at a minimum. Internationally, in my view, is likely, and domestically possibly. But even if it's never a domestic threat within the homeland, it will become such a threat to our allies and partners around the world, including inside the Middle East. The United States will have no choice but to respond. And then there's going to be a certain amount of, post-decision autopsy of how did we let this happen, who was asleep at the switch, et cetera, that we could avoid, but I don't think we're going to avoid it at this point. Another unavoidable risk is the sad reality that organizations like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and particularly the Haqqani network, but now associated with the Taliban, these are seasoned, experienced, and highly successful hostage takers. And even after the United States withdrawal later this year, there are going to be thousands of Americans and Westerners still in Afghanistan or in the broader region, whether they're associated with our embassy or they're doing NGO work or they have business ventures or they're contractors or they're doing aid and stabilization work, and all of them will be vulnerable to hostage taking. And unfortunately, the same capabilities, both intelligence and military, that are required to do counterterrorism are the very same capabilities required to do hostage rescue and hostage recovery. So to the degree our ability to do counterterrorism is attenuated, so will our ability to deal with hostage taking be attenuated. Lastly, before I shift, there's been a lot written about this, so I'll be very brief, but the departure of American forces from Afghanistan will obviously impair our ability to gather intelligence, which therefore will impair our ability to react to a near terrorist threat. I know a lot of talk is going on about over-the-horizon CT. Having personally once been a practitioner of over-the-horizon CT, everyone needs to understand how freaking hard that is. It is tenfold harder than doing it from within country for all kinds of reasons that I won't go into here. But we are accepting significant operational and strategic risk by deciding to try to do counterterrorism from well outside Afghanistan. I'll shift to one other topic before I end, since you asked me a broader question than just Afghanistan. The sad reality for us is that, as Charles has already indicated, but specifically to the Middle East, as I examine the trajectories of violent extremism across the Middle East, they're predominantly getting worse. Just one example is the extraordinary success that Iran has had in increasing its terrorist or terrorist-like proxy activities around the region. In my humble opinion, Iran has achieved breathtaking strategic success in that arena, and there's no end in sight as far as I can see. ISIS is clearly making a comeback in Iraq and Syria. They're probably never going to create the kind of geographic state they once aspired to, but all the indicators are they're coming back. And as I think everyone on this call knows, the catastrophe that has emerged in the internment camps and refugee camps in northern Syria that phenomenon which the international community has completely failed to address effectively, is storing up strategic trouble for the United States for decades. Again, this probably sounds like a race to the bottom comparing what I just said with what Charles said previously, but that's what I had to offer. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. Again, thank you for the optimism. And let me turn to the other facet, if you will, of the security environment that we're confronting in the region right now, and ask Chris Kubecka to talk a little bit about the cyber issues. And I would say that perhaps most significantly over the past 100 days has been the continuation of the friction, the mutual attacks between Iran and Israel in the cyber realm, and where do we see that? There was a question asked earlier in the conversation with Joey Hood about whether or not it's not problematic to have the Israelis continuing their cyber war with Iran while Rob Malley is in Vienna trying to negotiate a return to the JCPOA. But what's your sense of the status of that? Is there anything that surprised you in the cyber arena over the past 100 days? And where do you think we're going forward?
Well, one of the surprising things to me is there still is not solid policy when it comes to cyber for the Biden administration, both domestically and internationally. And there seems to be a mismatch between what we need in the physical world when it comes to things like national defense, terrorism, and keeping various groups from affecting our national security, our allies, and our partners. And with that gap, the cyber realm is something that is still sort of new to some people, which it really shouldn't, because basically, if you have an internet connection and, for example, the Iranians want to spread disinformation campaigns or to share technical expertise when it comes to different types of malware, surveillanceware, basically digital bombs, then they can do that with various groups anywhere that have internet connections. And we need to look at that very seriously and then also incorporate more cyber into counterterrorism. And some of the things I've seen and been problematic, as you stated, talking about things in Vienna, and at the same time, things are going on between Israel and Iran. But Israel has a lot of challenges because of the different groups that the Iranian government actually tries to prop up with various means, whether that's physical rockets and missiles and weapons, but also with cyber weapons. And this kind of mismatch is going to keep going on. And diplomatically, I mean, we all have to admit, I think, that the Iranian government does a lot of destabilization efforts, but they're shifting more and more towards the digital realm because it's so much easier. In the past, you had to send agents for sabotage events and for propaganda and put them, literally, some people and some boots on the ground. You don't have to do that anymore with disinformation and propaganda. And you can also see, and it's a bit unfortunate, but there's even been, unbeknownst to much of ISIS, infiltration by the Iranian government, propping them up without them knowing, and then causing more damage by sharing certain technical knowledge that benefits them. So I think one of the things that we need to look at is certainly some sort of cyber addendum to the Abraham Peace Accords, to further show that we have the Middle East in our minds and we understand the region's importance, and also a bit more of a combination with counterterrorism and cyber, because it's so much easier to do nowadays than it was before, logistically, physically, etc. So I agree with both of the speakers so far. We do not want to create a bigger problem. What I've seen in East Africa with my own eyes, I have seen in Mozambique the issue that is becoming more and more a real issue that we have to pay attention to. And some of those groups may or may not be supported by some of the technology, unbeknownst to them, by the Iranians. They certainly are supported with a North Korean program that you can actually rent their services to be taught how to do guerrilla warfare and bomb making in East Africa. So imagine what the Iranians can do, but with cyber.
Thanks, Chris. And Charles, I know you're going to turn into a pumpkin momentarily. So before I go to Charles Dunne, to catch you before you go, I just wanted to ask you to come back and talk a little bit about the issue that both Mike and Chris raised, and that is the nexus between Iranian policy and terrorism. Not only Iranian support for groups like the Houthis or Hezbollah, but also, in fact, their support for some of the Sunni terrorist groups. ISIS, AQ has long been, that there's long been a relationship between Iran and AQ. How do you see that evolving? And is that something that the administration should be addressing more aggressively?
Yeah, well, thank you for bringing me in towards the end of my time. I think, Iran's relationship with Al Qaeda is, as you say, nothing new. It has clearly evolved over the past 20 years, depending on circumstance, depending on need, depending on the domestic situation. I think from my perspective, and I'm not privy to classified information, which very occasionally has been sort of, gently implied in US government statements and was by Secretary Pompeo towards the end of the Trump administration. But from what I am aware of, Iran seems more engaged in terms of Al Qaeda's presence domestically in a game of leverage, of control, of having cards in its chest should it need to play them. I'm not convinced that Iran has been, paying the salaries of Al Qaeda operatives operating across the region, has been training its operatives to conduct attacks abroad. I haven't seen, sort of legitimate evidence of that, although I've certainly heard many claims. But they could very easily choose to do that if conditions in the region change. And I think many eyes should be on Afghanistan, frankly, right now, in terms of what comes next. Some eyes look at Russia and its ties in the past to the Taliban. But I think equally we should be looking at how Iran deals with a post-American Afghanistan as well, in terms of trying to buy influence and leverage in the country. But I think regionally, taking AQ out of the equation, I think General Nagata has, sort of hit the nail on the head. The extent to which Iran has built this array or this network of proxies across the region is extraordinary. And I think this administration has had a problem in the past in terms of squaring the circle between the fact that some of these proxies are essentially part of a state, or even trying to be the state themselves, looking at Yemen and Iraq in particular, and Syria, of course. But they've also engaged in terrorist activities. And so how to label them, how to treat them, is the sort of fundamental dilemma. And we've seen it with Hezbollah for many, many years. And I think we're equally likely to see it now play out in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in all possibility in other countries still to come. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I think, Joey Hood was saying, as kind of distasteful as it is, we have to deal with the Houthis like a political actor, even despite the fact that we know about their, distasteful and likely terrorist behavior too. There was an amazing report just released a few days ago as well about how effectively Iran has equipped these militias with sophisticated conventional military weapon systems. Several years ago, all the talk was about smuggling missiles into Yemen and Iraq and elsewhere. But this report had unearthed a great deal of evidence about how Iran has now equipped all of its main proxies in the region to produce precision-guided rockets and long-range missiles itself indigenously. I mean, that's transformed the entire regional power dynamic when you have proxies able to produce their own precision-guided ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, kamikaze drones, and what have you. I think they've played a smart game, and I'm not sure we've really got a counter to that. And I think, regionally, the power dynamic is only still likely to continue to change, whether we're part of it or not. And Iran is a step ahead of us in that sense.
Thank you, Charles. And I'm going to want to come back and drill down a little bit on that with Mike Nagata in a moment. But before we do that, I want to turn to Charles Dunne to talk a little bit about the human rights situation. And again, we saw in the campaign last year, clearly as a candidate, Joe Biden spoke very aggressively about the need to reassert your traditional U.S. values, if you will, in terms of promoting human rights, civil liberties, protection of dissidents, et cetera, et cetera. That they were going to be different from the Trump administration, which in itself is a very low bar, as we know. But there have been two actions over the first 100 days in the administration, I think, that have raised some eyebrows, frankly, about what, how the Biden administration actually intends to pursue these issues. One, of course, is the management of the Jamal Khashoggi aftermath and the release of the intelligence community's assessment, where I think there was some expectation that the administration would take a harder position on Mohammed bin Salman, but in the event decided not to do that. And then also the decision to move ahead with some arms sales to Egypt, despite, of course, the fairly harsh human rights environment in Egypt these days. And of course, we heard Joey Hood speak a little bit about the issue related to MBS and Saudi Arabia, and the way forward and the requirement to maintain a positive relationship, but also the commitment to raise human rights issues in each of the senior leadership meetings that we conduct with the Saudis. But what is your sense really of where on the spectrum do you see the Biden administration coming down on human rights issues, and what does this mean for the future?
Okay, thanks very much, Jerry. Yeah, you pointed out a number of very important developments that the kind of international and certainly the U.S. domestic human rights community has had their eye on very closely since the administration began 100 days ago. And it is true that the Biden administration set for itself a very high standard when it came into office. They were going to be the anti-Trump on democracy and human rights issues. In fact, they said that we will have a foreign policy, and I quote here, centered on the defense of democracy and the protection of human rights. In other words, we treat this group of issues more as a national security issue than as kind of the window dressing that it had been in some previous administrations. Now, what did this mean regarding the Middle East? Well, it seemed to mean that the administration would crack down on some of the human rights abusers that President Trump had grown very cozy with. For example, Saudi Arabia, as you mentioned, on the campaign trail, candidate Biden said he would treat Saudi Arabia as the pariah state it is, his words, not mine. And as far as Egypt, he said there would be, and I quote here, no more blank checks for Trump's favorite dictator, referring, of course, to President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi of Egypt. But it seems to me that if the first 100 days proves anything, it is that enacting a clean break with the past and a really robust human rights agenda, especially regarding the Middle East, is much easier said than done. And the idealism of the campaign is clearly beginning very early on to run into the imperatives of maintaining national security interests and national security relationships. So the administration jumped out to a quick start here. It named several senior appointments, including Tony Blinken, who do have an interest in and a background in human rights. The president quickly fulfilled a campaign pledge to end Trump's so-called Muslim ban. I think he did that by executive order on his first day in office. He also indicated the administration's intent to rejoin the UN Human Rights Council, which President Trump had pulled the US out of back in 2018. And the administration also ended sanctions and visa restrictions on officials of the International Criminal Court. We have not rejoined or actually joined at all the International Criminal Court. We have our objections to what they're doing, but no longer are we going to actually treat them as something of a terrorist organization with sanctions and so on. More substantively regarding the Middle East, of course, the Biden administration announced that it was going to end support for offensive operations by Saudi Arabia in Yemen, and then for better or for worse, decided to reverse Trump's intended declaration of the Houthi rebels as a terrorist organization, which, if it had gone into effect, would have seriously complicated efforts to deliver humanitarian aid to Yemen. So all of these were greeted on the human rights side of the ledger by the human rights community as reasonably encouraging developments. But there have been a lot of serious disappointments as well. And you've named a couple of them. But one of them, of course, is the refugee ceiling, which President Biden had promised to lift. Then he reversed himself, said that we would stick with the Trump era level of 15,000 refugee admissions per year, which is a 40-year low. Now the original raised limit of 62,500 refugees may be back on the table. But this clearly upset a lot of people who were looking for him to fulfill a pledge on this score. You mentioned the report on Khashoggi. Yes, the Biden administration did release a report which clearly named Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman as the person who ordered the killing. And this report had been suppressed and withheld by the Trump administration. But of course, Biden refused to sanction MBS personally in the interest of preserving the relationship with Saudi Arabia, although the administration did issue sanctions on a number of other entities and individuals in Saudi Arabia and formally created something called the Khashoggi ban, which is aimed at punishing not only Saudis, by the way. This can be used against other individuals who, on behalf of governments, as the declaration goes, engage in repression, harassment, or efforts to harm human rights activists and journalists and dissidents abroad. We can talk about that more if you would like to. On the arms sale front, the administration also declared that it would go ahead with the $23 billion arms sale to the UAE, Saudi Arabia's chief partner up until recently in the Yemen war. This includes not only F-35 aircraft, but armed Reaper drones. The administration also went ahead with a surface-to-air missile sale to Egypt, and it's indicated that most of the arms sales that the Trump administration intended to push through are probably going to go through to Saudi Arabia, with the exception of certain weapon systems that could be used in an offensive capacity in Yemen. So in this regard, Egypt is going to be the next big test. Now, the State Department currently has a decision to make because there are $300 million in foreign military funding subject to human rights conditions, and it has to decide whether to release to Egypt or not. Now, both the Obama and the Trump administrations routinely issued national security waivers to permit release of this $300 million. And a number of human rights groups have pushed back very strongly against this, saying we shouldn't cut Egypt any more slack because since 2014, when this conditionality was written into law, the human rights situation in Egypt has actually deteriorated dramatically. There haven't been any improvements at all. So having raised expectations for a much tougher line against Sisi, Biden now risks serious blowback from human rights watchers and activists if he doesn't come through on this. And more importantly, he risks sending a message to Egypt and other human rights abusers in the region that you can expect business as usual with the Biden administration, rhetoric on human rights and democracy aside. So this is an important decision. Now, I usually like to wait at least 6 months until I say something's at a crossroads, but I really think that something's at a crossroads right here, and it's the future of the Biden administration's human rights agenda in the Middle East. The problem here is that the administration risks overpromising and underperforming, especially since it's raised all these high expectations itself. Whether they're going to hold themselves to account on this or not has a lot of people worried. So what I think the administration needs to do at this point, it needs to be strategic in how it thinks about this entire agenda in order to put the human rights agenda on a stronger footing. Now, what does this mean? Well, in the first instance, I think it means trying to avoid lurching from controversy to controversy and ad hoc decision to ad hoc decision, and sort of decide that it's going to implement principles or a principled agenda, which it is then going to apply more or less across the board in the region. And I have 3 suggestions where the administration might look to craft such a principled agenda. First one is it has to make protection of civil society and human rights defenders in the region, across the region, a much higher priority. It should speak out against jailings of individuals who are defending human rights. It should speak out against repressive laws that are intended to crush both the voice and the work of the NGO community. This applies to Egypt, it applies to Saudi Arabia, it applies to Iran, it applies to a number of countries who are both friends and foes of the United States. Second, I think the Biden team needs to begin rethinking the securitization of US Middle East policy. And what this means is that increasing amounts of US aid resources are being channeled into security assistance programs, which is crowding out the money available that's there for democracy and governance assistance in a lot of places. This is accelerated under the Trump administration, but it's not unique to the Trump administration. If he does this, if the president does do this, begin to rethink where we're channeling these resources, he will find allies in Congress. There are a lot of people who believe in just this idea that we should be assisting with economy, we should be assisting with governance and so on, and downplaying security as a central element of our foreign aid programs. And third, and finally, I would say that the administration needs to start enforcing its existing laws on arms sales and end-use requirements, including the Leahy law. The administration should be issuing national security waivers and other exceptions to arms only as an exception and not as the rule, which is it's often seen to be, particularly with close allies like Saudi Arabia and Egypt. It doesn't need new legislation. It needs to simply look at what tools are available to the administration to enforce some respect for human rights and how US weapons are used once they're transferred. So I'll conclude here, but I would just say that, in short, the administration needs to be have a strategic approach, a principled approach. If it begins to do this while it's sorting out its overall policy towards the region, it can do a great deal to put not only the human rights agenda on a better footing as it approaches the region, but as it approaches the world and our many autocratic foes as well. So,
thank you so much, Charles. And I think again a lot of really fascinating insights to pursue. I wanted to go back and kind of follow up on one of your last points with Mike for a moment. In the specific case of the president's decision on withdrawing support from the Saudi-led coalition offensive in Yemen or military activities, and of course that was a decision that the president had said he would make when he was on the campaign trail. He in fact made it. There was an expectation, I believe, when he made that commitment and followed through, that would open the door for a political process to begin in Yemen. I would say, in my own defense, that I never agreed with that. I always thought that many people, including many people now in the Biden administration, overemphasized the Saudi role in the Yemen civil war without understanding particularly the Yemeni role in the Yemen civil war. But regardless, the fact of the matter is that things have not played out in Yemen the way I anticipate that the administration expected. And so now we're back in a situation where the Houthis have, again, and this was a question that Elise asked Joey Hood, where the Houthis perhaps have misinterpreted Joe Biden's intentions, have perhaps concluded that they now have a green light to relaunch their military offensive and perhaps to achieve the military victory that was denied to them as long as the Saudis were engaged. And the question is now in front of the administration again as to what are we going to do about it? Are we going to give a green light to the Saudis to re-engage? There are some people who are suggesting that we've already done that. Or how are we going to go forward? And so, Mike, your thoughts are welcome.
Thank you, Jerry. Another Gordian knot for me to try to help somebody untie. More seriously, my personal view is that the decision to suspend or curtail assistance to the Saudis regarding Yemen illuminates a pretty fundamental misunderstanding of both what is happening in Yemen, what actually has been happening in Yemen for several years now, and also in a rather surprising way seems to indicate we don't even understand as a society or as a government what impact we actually have. First of all, I think a lot of the people in the audience probably don't realize that the military support the United States has been giving to the Saudis since the origins of their intervention several years ago has been fairly limited. A lot of it, and I was personally involved in some of this, a lot of the effort was mostly to try to ensure the Saudis were more precise in avoiding collateral damage than it was in somehow enabling them to create more violence and mayhem. We were trying to help the Saudis get a better understanding of what are you striking? Can you actually identify them and associate them as part of a military threat that does need to be dealt with, or how much collateral damage are you likely to do? A lot of people don't know that, but I can attest, having been personally involved in it, that was at the front and center of our military support to them. That's not to say that our military support hasn't occasionally been used for unintended purposes. It certainly has, but a lot of our effort was not intended for that. Anyways, I think the larger point, though, is that the both the origins and the course and the current status of the conflict in Yemen is so much bigger than just Yemen, and so much bigger than just Saudi Arabia and Yemen. It is entangled with virtually every other geostrategic problem in that part of the region, including Iran, because Iran obviously are sponsors of the Houthis. And so I think that one of the reasons the administration seems to be encountering surprise because our curtailing of support to the Saudis wasn't a game changer, that simply demonstrates that we didn't understand that our role has not been central to what's been happening there. So getting back to what you said in the way you framed your question, the origins and the course of the conflict in Yemen, and I feel terrible saying this because you're 10 times the expert in Yemen than I am, but even I understand as an occasional visitor there that this conflict that has emerged between the Houthis and their contestants on the other side are generations old. I mean, this goes back so far, and some of the motivations and the causes that continue to propel the violence are so deep-seated, it really doesn't matter in large measure what the Saudis choose to do or not to do, and even less what the United States chooses to do or not to do. That's not to say that the international community has no role to play here. The amount of human suffering in Yemen has been a disgrace to all of us. The fact that the international community, including the United States, have allowed things to get this bad for so many hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians is a stain on all of us. But I think the fundamental problem we have, to try to sum it all up, is that we have been both intellectually lazy and we have been very arrogant in an unintended kind of way, that somehow we can pull the levers that will bring this conflict and the suffering to an end. We're not that good. We're not that smart. It's not that we don't have a role to play, but so long as we think that we understand what the solution is and we actually have levers to pull to create that solution, we're just going to continue to fail.
Thanks, Mike. We only have a few minutes left. Chris, I want to ask you to follow up on something that Charles mentioned. And as part of his presentation, he talked a little bit about what is now called the Khashoggi Rule, which requires or imposes on the administration a responsibility to respond to instances where actors acting on the behest of governments basically are responsible for oppression, for going after human rights activists, journalists, et cetera, et cetera. Clearly, one of the tools that is now available to many of our friends and partners in the region are these various tools for hacking, for tracking individuals, for spying on people both domestically and abroad. You had mentioned that the administration really has not presented a very well developed kind of cyber vision for the administration. How do you anticipate, knowing what you do about where the administration is, how do you anticipate that the administration is going to handle this? Understanding as well, of course, that the purveyors of this equipment also, more often than not, are close friends and partners of ours.
Well, it definitely is a challenge. I mean, looking at how human rights groups, NGOs, journalists, et cetera, can be targeted and their human rights violated, it's a very serious issue. Recently, I was working with Al Jazeera on an investigation where the Syrian government actually was able to break into a satellite telecom system and then track journalists, including a US citizen that they targeted for assassination. So we have to look at how technology plays a part in this. How do they have these opportunities to track these individuals? How do they have the opportunity to spread disinformation about them, propaganda, censor them, and restrict them has to be looked at very seriously. I think taking a look at existing laws, like Charles suggested, and really enforcing them and adding that piece of the puzzle into it is very, very important. Now, it's also a challenge the fact that the US government also purchases some of these tools for counterterrorism and their own national defense. But in the hands of groups that are not going to use it in the same manner, it can be very, very dangerous. And so I do believe that it takes a lot of time to write new legislation, excuse me, but expanding on existing is extremely important because in the digital world, anyone can find you and a lot of bad things can happen. And we need to seriously look at that and include that in a stronger cyber policy and also expansion of existing laws.
Thanks, Chris. So we have just a couple of minutes left, and I'm going to ask each of you to, we have a question from the audience. An individual who's now attended 4 webinars this morning, which suggests to me that this person should probably go outside and take a walk or something. But in any event, this person has attended 4 webinars, and what they're asking for is how would you prioritize and what do you think the risks and trade-offs are in continuing to promote your issue? The question was related to CT, but I'll broaden it out. Your issue that you're advocating. So let's begin 1 minute apiece. Let me begin with you, Mike.
All right, Jerry, you've heard this line from me before, but whether I focus on our counterterrorism related interests or just our geostrategic interests regarding the Middle East, my personal opinion is that the United States needs to recapture an idea and an activity that, unfortunately, right now, most policymakers tend to heap scorn on than to advocate for, and that is to return to striving to regain our reputation as the most generous nation in the region. Not that we should be wasting taxpayers' dollars or anything remotely of the kind, but our generosity for decades created our outsized influence across that region. That doesn't mean everything we did was perfect, doesn't mean we got every outcome we wanted, but as a general rule, the United States was a force for good and stability in the region for many decades. That is far less true today, and I personally attribute it to our loss of a belief in the power of generosity. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Chris?
Well, I would have to agree with Mike because the United States had a lot of power in the realm of good ideas and kindness and generosity. And since that has been diminished, even in recent decades, it has left a lot of people out. And some of those people who have been left out, when we talk about generations now in certain types of refugee camps, they have not looked upon us very favorably. And that has unfortunately caused a lot of strife, violence, etc. And we need to be kind of back to where we were, but also in an honest way, in a bit more transparent way, so that it isn't looked upon that we are only favoring certain groups, but favoring everyone's, for instance, human rights as a whole.
Thanks, Chris. And Charles, last word to you.
Thanks. Listen, I agree with both Chris and General Nagata, and I think they both put it very well, especially in terms of the point on generosity. There are many ways to be generous, and being generous with our support for people who are seeking a better life in terms of human rights, in terms of democracy, and so on, I think is an integral part of that. And that's kind of what I was getting at the beginning of my remarks when I was suggesting that maybe the Biden administration is looking at human rights as more of a national security issue, as opposed to simply window dressing, something nice to say, but always gets cast to the side of the road whenever we need some security interest. fulfilled. I think there's a way to do both, and this does mean trade-offs. It means that human rights are not going to be our top concern every time we deal with Saudi Arabia, for example, but they should be a consistent concern at least. And especially the people who are looking to have their human rights respected and are looking to defend those rights should be hearing a consistent message from the United States that we do care, we do support you. And that show of solidarity, I mean, it's rhetorical, but it's really more important than many people think. People want to know that they're not abandoned by the United States. And this is something that if we do this can have a very powerful impact without cutting off arms sales or sanctioning individuals. I think that can have a very powerful effect and something that really should be a key element of our approach to the region going forward.
Great. Thank you so much. And with that, we unfortunately have to bring this panel discussion to a close. We certainly have a lot of grist that we could have continued to mill for quite a long time. But I want to thank our guests, Mike Nagata, Chris Kubecka, Charles Dunne, and Charles Lister for joining us for this conversation. I do hope that you also tune in for the next panel discussion. And I want to thank all of you in our audience for joining us this morning.